schedule now. How about that for a change?
That's the first time.
Don't jinx it.
Okay, so survey research in the digital age. So one question that I get, some of my own research is about surveys and sampling, and one question that I get a lot from data scientists is this question, like, why should I care about surveys? A lot of people who are not trained as social scientists, I would say, hate surveys. I don't think that is too strong of a word. They think they are not useful, they are annoying and stupid. And I think that's not totally the right way to think about it, obviously. I think a lot of the reason is that many of these data scientists, their experience with surveys comes as being a participant in a survey. And the experience of being a participant in a survey is terrible. It's bewildering and boring, and it's not clear what is happening, and all of the thought and care that went into creating that survey, hopefully, the thought and care that went into creating it. So for social scientists who have been on the other side of this interaction and have been involved in creating surveys, I think we realize that surveys are a really fundamental measurement tool. That's like one of the best ways we have of measuring the world. It's like we talked about microscopes and telescopes as measurement technologies. Surveys are kind of our measurement technology. And so I think the past has clearly shown that surveys are a useful way to learn about the world. And in fact, most of what we know quantitatively about the world comes through surveys. So it seems like it would be unwise to ignore this technology. So then the second question that comes, and this comes from both social scientists and data scientists, is why should I care about surveys in the age of big data? So isn't it the case that like Twitter and all kinds of government administrative records are just going to make surveys obsolete? And I think that is wrong. That's completely wrong. So I think we're always going to ask people questions, and there's kind of three fundamental reasons. So the first is the limitations of big data sources. So we talked about that some a couple days ago. Another way to think about it is this distinction. So when I was in high school, there was this clothing company called FUBU. I don't know, this dates me some. So it stands for us, by us. And I think one way to think about what these big data sources are is they are new food, new boo. They are not for us, and they are not by us, right? The people who are creating these sources don't think in the same way that we think, and their goals are not the same as our goals. Often their goals are to make a better service for their users and generate profit for their company. And so that problem is not going to go away. So let's say Moore's Law continues and all these great new things come around technologically. This is kind of a fundamental thing, that these sources just aren't created for people like us, by people like us, and so they're focused on different kinds of things. The second thing is that a lot of the big data sources have information about behavior, and social scientists like to make a distinction between internal states and external states. So internal states are things like attitudes, emotions, expectations for the future, and these are important things that social scientists want to explain as outcomes and use to help predict other kinds of behavior. And so often if you want to know about internal states, a much better thing is to ask someone than to try to infer that from their external state. So let's say we wanted to know your opinion about your attitudes about what is happening in Syria now. So like we could go to your Twitter page and try to look through everything you said on Twitter, or we could like look at everything you buy with your credit card. These are kinds of external behaviors. That's not really going to be the most effective way to infer certain kinds of internal states. So if we want to know about internal states, we really should ask about them. And then the final thing is that a lot of this big data is inaccessible, and I think will be permanently inaccessible. In the sense that the barriers of us getting access to the data that, let's say, banks or telephone companies hold, it's not entirely a technical barrier. So the technical barriers of, oh, it's hard to move the data, it's hard for us to compute on such big data, that is true. But I think those problems will get easier, but the legal and ethical problems and the business competitive issues, those are not going to go away with Moore's Law. So I think for a lot of reasons, this data will stay inaccessible kind of permanently. And so if it's inaccessible, then it doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, but we can't use it for our research, so we will have to collect our own data. But how we do surveys is going to have to change. So surveys have always changed based on the kinds of things that were happening in society, and as society changes, surveys will have to change. So roughly, you can split the history of survey research into 3 eras. And I think this is important to understand because first it helps us realize that what we're doing now is not like the thing that we've been doing since time began, right? What we're doing now was created by us, and so what we do in the future will also be created by us. And then also this history reveals there was a previous moment in history that I think can help us understand the current moment in history. So survey research kind of as we know it is relatively new, and it began around, let's say, the 1930s. And so in the earliest era of surveys, sampling was all done by area probability sampling. Basically, they would pick certain geographic regions randomly and then go visit those regions. And then they would knock on people's doors and interview them in person, face-to-face interviews. And then in many wealthy countries, there was a transition that happened around the 60s and 70s, the widespread diffusion of landline telephone. So there was a technological change in the world, and researchers said, hey, we can use these telephone things to do surveys. What an amazing idea. And so the main form of survey research in this second era was random digit dial surveys, so they randomly call phone numbers, and then they interview people over the telephone. And so that is maybe the world of survey research that you have heard about and maybe take for granted. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is that this transition was incredibly contested. While this was going on, proponents of this first era approach said, no, you can't do interviews over the telephone. That's crazy. Like, people might answer differently over the telephone than they answer when you're talking to them in person. And that was probably true. And they said, not everyone has a telephone. And the people that have telephones are different than the people that don't have telephones. That was also probably true. But eventually, researchers worked to solve these problems because the opportunities that were created by doing surveys over the telephone were really great. The biggest of which being much faster and much cheaper. So there were problems, and rather than avoiding those problems, the researchers solved those problems. So now we're moving into the third era, and so the second era is kind of in the process of decaying right now, and the third era is beginning. And this transition, again, it's very contested. There are a lot of people who want to keep doing what we've done in the second era, and there are some people that want to start doing new things, what we're going to do in the third era. So my personal guess, and this is not, I mean, other people think this too, but now we're moving into speculation about what the future of survey research is going to look like. And I think it will be characterized by non-probability sampling, which I'll talk about a lot later, computer-administered interviews, rather than having, in these first 2 eras, interviews were administered by humans, and I think increasingly interviews will be administered by computers. And part of this is largely motivated by cost savings, but I think also it creates a lot of new opportunities. And I'll talk about some of those specific opportunities. And then finally, there's going to be a third dimension, which is the way survey research in the third era will involve surveys much more being linked to other data sources. So right now, in the past, many surveys were relatively standalone things. I'm a researcher, I'm going to do a survey. And then that was it. It was your survey. Now, increasingly, as the data environment in the world gets richer and richer, it becomes harder and harder to do something that's standalone. It's much more attractive to link that to all the other data that exists. So we're going to see a lot more ways where surveys will try to integrate with other forms of data. And so what we're gonna talk about today is these three chunks. The three main things I think will characterize this third era. Now, before we do that, there's one idea from the first two eras that I think is very important and will carry over into the third era, and this is called the total survey error framework. So this is something that I guess the way, I don't know exactly the history of this, but my sense is that this evolved inductively over time as survey researchers realized all the possible things that could go wrong in surveys. And they kept saying, oh, this is a problem, and then someone else will write a paper, this is a problem, and someone else will write a paper, this is a problem. And then eventually they sort of clustered and combined this together into this one framework that helps you sort of understand all the problems and how they're related. And this is something that's independent of any of the specific technologies that we talked about. So basically they like to break the problems into two main areas: problems about who we ask, and then problems about how we ask. So this is usually stuff related to sampling, and this is usually stuff related to interviewing and measurements. This is generally the area of sort of, this is much more mathematical. This is amenable to probability calculations and so on. This is much more sort of like psychology and cognitive science. This is much harder to formalize mathematically. The one area that I think has been really well formalized here is educational testing. So right, that is a measurement challenge. They have very sophisticated techniques that they develop so that when they give you something like the GRE, they can claim that they're measuring something. So in general, this is, roughly speaking, this is more of a science and this is more of an art. But people are working hard to make this art better. Yeah?
I was just wondering, for the areas where it's well developed, could you give us some insights into how they're doing that, for example, with the GRE?
I would say I could recommend a book on that, but the short answer is they are very clear about what they're trying to measure. They have multiple indicators of that thing. They have lots of data, and then they estimate statistical models to do the measurement. And now that is different than the way think about how we measure like your attitude about Syria, let's say. So we don't have really a formal definition of what we're measuring. We don't often have multiple questions about it. We don't often, so like in educational testing, they often test new items mixed into old items. They do all kinds of stuff to make sure that their measurement stays calibrated in a way that we don't do with a lot of attitudes. Yeah?
And we also often have in educational testing, I'm not an expert on that, but kind of adaptive testing where you have difficulty and ability parameters, item response theory is a lot of that. So you estimate these parameters, and depending on how the respondent scores at a particular question, you give them more difficult or more easy questions, and kind of to test their ability in a shorter, so to speak, setting, and not giving them all the easy questions when they can clearly answer all those.
Yeah, so adaptive interviewing is something that I think will characterize much more the third era. It's already happening in educational testing. It doesn't happen that much in public opinion surveys. It will come up some, though, in the Wiki survey project. In fact, that's one of the things that we think is most exciting about new ways of asking questions. Let me give one example of the total survey error. Let me walk through these pieces a little bit more, and then we'll collect up some questions or comments about this. So here's a motivating example. President Trump won the election. Many people were surprised by this because the polls did not expect this to happen. So after this was over, a lot of people said, how did the polls go wrong? So actually, I remember thinking about that night. And then the next morning, walking into campus, and I ran into some computer scientists, and they were like totally shocked, like what is going on? And I said, well, you know, it's probably one of the two parts of the total survey error framework. And they're like, what are you talking about? And then I sort of explained, like, there's kind of two main buckets of problems. There's like who you talk to and what you learn from the people that you talk to. And it could have been a problem in either of those buckets. And then we could speculate about what there are lots of possible versions of what could have been in each bucket, but it helps sort of organize your thinking. And so a much more formal, thoughtful version of that conversation was organized by the group called APOR, American Association of Public Opinion Researchers. So they formed a blue ribbon commission to try to understand what happened with the polls during the 2016 election. You can link to the full report here. So using this as a motivating example, let's think a little bit about problems with who we could ask. So the idea is, first, when you're making an estimate of some quantity, you have to define the population that you wish to make this estimate about. So when we think about who you plan to vote for, we don't really want to include children because they can't vote. We don't necessarily want to include registered voters. So the first thing that, whenever someone tells me they want to do a survey, the first thing I say is, okay, what's your target population? Like, who are you trying to learn about? That's like the first question you have to answer. Then, often you can't actually interview everyone in your target population, so there's a different group of people that you can actually access, and these are called your frame population. And so sometimes there's a difference between your target population and your frame population. So in the case of registered voters, if you did a landline-based sample, your sampling frame would be all people living in households who have landlines. Your target population might be all eligible voters. There's not a match between these two. And without some kind of statistical assumptions, you can't learn anything about the people who you can't reach with your survey, right? So you can only learn about the frame population. And if the frame population doesn't match the target population, then you're doing some kind of extrapolation, model-based adjustment. And that kind of thing can be potentially hidden, but that is somewhere in whatever it is that you're doing. Yeah?
So it sounds like there are two ways that the frame population can have error. One is that it under-includes the target population. The other is that it includes, like, people that are not part of the target population. Do you correct for both in different ways?
Yes, so that's exactly right. So if you do landline telephones, you might include people who are not registered voters. So usually the problem of including ineligibles is easier to deal with because you ask a screener question. Are you an eligible voter? If not, see you later. So it's a good point. There's two kinds of problems. One is relatively easy to deal with, and one is easy to deal with by extrapolation, but hard to know how well you're doing. Then, from this frame population, you take a sample, and then there's error that's introduced because the sample is not the same size as the entire population. Finally, of the people that you select to be in your sample, you don't actually get to interview all of them. You only interview a subset of them. They're the respondents. And then the difference between the sample population and the respondents is non-response error. And so this error is very, very, very important now because people don't like answering surveys. So there's kind of two problems that you run into. One is you can't even actually contact the people, or they never reply to your attempts to contact them. And then the second is if you do contact them, they refuse. So these two things, both of them, which have different sources, potentially, have been increasing over time, and now in a standard telephone survey, you get response rates of around 10%, which, if you use some fancy math, you realize is a non-response rate of 90%, which sounds really bad. And it is really bad. And the non-response rates on government surveys, like very expensive surveys done by the government to do things like measuring unemployment, those have better response rates. But the trend is very clear. I should have included this graph. Like, there's a graph that shows the non-response rates of, like, the 5 biggest, most expensive government surveys, and they're all moving very clearly in the same direction for the last 20 years.
How much better is better, out of curiosity?
So this is a big question, and it's not one that, how much better?
Yeah, how much better are they? Like the
so
population.
those, I can tell you the paper that has the exact numbers, but I would say those have non-response rates closer to 30% non-response, so response rates of 70%. But those are extremely expensive. The other question, what I thought you were asking, is how much of a difference does it make?
No,
But that is a separate question. It's not totally clear. Some people would argue actually a non-response rate of 90% doesn't actually cause problems in the estimates. And that is an open empirical question. And then somewhat related to what we're going to do, because they say, okay, we have only 10% of the people respond, but then we're going to do some corrections and fix the problem, and we'll still get pretty good estimates. And there have been some studies empirically, actually these are interesting, where they do what they call standard techniques, where they have like not super great response rate, and then expensive techniques where they call people a lot and use specially trained people and do all kinds of extra effort. So all that extra effort increases the response rate, but actually doesn't substantively change the estimates very much. So this is something survey researchers have done carefully, and that is part of the reason they are less concerned about this problem than some other people. But those studies that I just described were done probably 10 years ago, and so the response rates have continued to get bad since then, and the costs have continued to get worse since then too. Yep.
Do we know if there's been changes in the causes of non-response over that time? So like in the midst of the overall increase in non-response, is it like young people are responding less, or?
I personally don't know, but I know like the National Academy had a report about non-response, so I would guess they're like, this is the big, non-response is like the thing survey researchers, a lot of them are working on now. There's been special issues of journals about it. There's like a ton of emphasis on it. I think largely, this is the part that maybe not everyone would agree with. I think largely there's this very strong attempt to try to patch the current paradigm rather than not nearly as much emphasis in trying to develop a new paradigm, right? And so I think a lot of these concerns about non-response are really about how can we fix up and keep this second era running a little bit longer. Yeah?
I mean, the only thing that I would say that sort of maybe challenges that is
Yeah.
that, NORC is now spending tons and tons of money to go back to what you described as the first error and actually do door knocking on hard to reach populations.
Yes.
So I do think there's some, I mean, I think there's some, like, significant awareness of the problem.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
This, yeah, absolutely. Like,
Well, no, I would even say just like, even if 2016 hadn't happened, right? But I would say
no, absolutely. Like, everyone in survey research knows about this problem, for sure. It is true that some people are going back now to first era methods, and those introduce substantial cost. So I think cost is something we haven't talked about as much in some of these other, I guess we've talked some about cost. But so in surveys, cost is an important element to consider, obviously. It's why we do surveys. Like, ideally we would interview everyone, but we can't. It's cost prohibitive, so we do a sample. So there are certain techniques that can minimize some of these problems. Sometimes those techniques are very expensive, which makes them hard to do except for certain kinds of problems. Like the GSS, the General Social Survey, they do face-to-face interviews. It's very expensive. They estimated in this paper it's $3 per question, per response. That's a lot. I mean, for certain kinds of things, society will pay for that, but for other kinds of things, it seems unlikely. Yeah.
I'm just curious, maybe you'll get to it, but wouldn't non-response be a big problem versus if you're doing closed versus open questions?
So I would say closed and open questions, that goes in this bucket of how we learn from the people we talk to. So I would say that I would tend to think of them as different problems.
Okay. I guess maybe in the correction of non-probabilistic sampling, it seems like it'd be a problem.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. So in the so is this about thinking about ethnography? Yeah. So like one of the things so in ethnography they often do non-probability based sampling, and so one of the things that we're sort of maybe going to see in this activity is we can take some non-probability based sampling, do some adjustments to it, and produce something that looks like it comes from a probability sample. So that might sound very attractive to ethnographers, except I think that the adjustment techniques, I don't think they could be ported over super cleanly. Because the data structure, you'll see that in doing the kinds of post-stratification that you're going to do, it's very helpful that the answers are numbers, and you're going to just reweight the numbers. It's hard to imagine how you would reweight what you learn in ethnography, but it might be possible.
You need a topic modeling.
So one other thing, and this will come up a lot, like the idea of representativeness is not really a part of the total survey error framework. This is a concept that's used by people outside of the survey community, but within the survey community, it's not used as frequently. So there's no idea, there's no belief within the survey world that this sample population needs to be a miniature version of the target population. And we'll talk much more about that in the sampling chunk. Okay, we talked about each of these. So in the case about Trump, there are lots of reasons to imagine that the people who ended up responding to the survey might have been different than the people who were in the sample. That's a place you might think that some of the error could have been introduced. This is a place that you might have think also some of the error could be introduced. The people who are potentially captured in the survey are different. This is not necessarily, this is the place that we most often look when we have our confidence intervals and p-values and all of that stuff, and that is, in my opinion, not often where a lot of the error really is. So this error will go away as the samples get bigger and bigger. This error will not go away as the samples get bigger and bigger. Okay? So then the second thing is, how do we actually learn from people while we're talking to them? And here, in the book I gave some examples where the wording of the question can impact how people answer it, the order of the question. We've talked some about social media data potentially having a positive bias that people like to post about happy things. Also in surveys, there's to some extent that people don't like to reveal embarrassing things about themselves. So here, again, in the Trump setting, we could imagine that people were supporting Trump but didn't want to reveal this in a survey, or didn't reveal it given the way the question was asked, or the order of the questions that were asked in. This could have, yeah?
So I'm not sure if this is unique to politics, but like he did lose the popular vote, so most of the surveys did get that right. Like, doesn't it come down to like some kind of uniqueness in our political system, like a couple 100,000 people in like 3 states or something like that?
Yeah, so the polls that they analyzed in this particular report focused on the state-by-state polls. So it is true that he did not win the popular vote. It is also true that in the state-by-state polls, there were incorrect estimates. And you can read the full details here. Let me tell you a little bit about what they found. So they start by saying that the national polls were generally correct, which is a great way for survey researchers to start a report. The state level polls showed that they were competitive in uncertain contests, so again, we weren't so wrong, but clearly they underestimated Trump's support in the upper Midwest. So and then they go through a lot of possible theories about why this might have happened, and they come up with 3 explanations that they think are the most likely. One is that there was real change in vote preference during the final week. So this is actually not a problem with the surveys, right? They're measuring the population changes, you can't blame them for that. That's kind of what they would say. The second is adjusting for overrepresentation of college graduates was critical, but many polls did not do it. So here we have a representation kind of explanation. It seems like they were more likely to interview college graduates than what you would expect based on their prevalence in the population. They didn't correct for that sufficiently. And then the third is some Trump voters did not reveal themselves as Trump voters until after the election, and that those people outnumbered late revealing Clinton voters. Yeah.
So does that second point suggest that education was not accounted for in the weights? Because that seems to me...
Yeah, so I think what they would say is some of the polls, so we don't know how, a lot of times polls, they don't document exactly how they do this post-stratification. So part of it is some of the polls might not, or the exact way that you include education can matter. So it's possible they didn't include it in the right way. So whenever you try to fix up these estimates, often that fixing up is not very well documented, and it matters exactly how you do it.
Empirical question, the final results, were they generally within the margin of error?
So I don't know, this was merely I'm not an expert on the 2016 election. I think one question though is if they were, so the margin of error is the sampling error, right? Not these other sources of error. And then even if they were all within the margin of error, if they were all consistently on one side,
Yeah.
that would be not a good sign as well.
Yeah, you said one of the strengths of survey study is we can see the internal state of the people,
Yeah.
right? But the third point is show some internal states still it's very difficult to
Yes.
be evaluated,
Yes.
right?
I think that's
maybe one of the great challenge.
yes. I think it's totally right. So it is the case that surveys do not allow us to peer into people's souls. We should totally
Yeah, basically maybe the
we should never expect that, but if we want to peer into other people's souls, what is the best way of doing it? Like, I don't think there's a way of doing it that's better than surveys for certain kinds of problems. That doesn't mean it's perfect. It doesn't even mean it's good always, but sometimes we don't have a choice. Okay, any questions? So, Total Survey Error Framework helps you basically organize things that can go wrong. It was developed kind of inductively over time. It's a useful kind of heuristic. If you've never dealt with surveys before, this will help you isolate the kinds of things you're worried about and communicate those concerns to other people and potentially fix them. But if you're worried about a sampling problem, then focusing on the questionnaire is not going to help. And if you're worried about a measurement problem, then thinking about the sampling is not going to help. And then this also helps us think about what kinds of opportunities are created by the digital age, because we can have opportunities in terms of who we ask and how we ask them questions. And then the best book I would recommend for learning more about the Total Survey Error Framework is Groves et al. 2009. It's a very good introduction to the entire sort of life cycle of surveys. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
I think the presentation needs a small context, specific context that you have to put on it, especially in South Africa, where we are still in the first age of survey, actually.
Yes.
And maybe we never have the second age that jump into the
Yes.
third age.
So I think that would be great to skip the whole second age. I mean, this kind of thing happened with like landline telephones, right? People jump right to mobile phones and then they skip this whole intermediate stage. I think some of the challenges so we'll see to what a lot of the third era approaches require a lot of digital infrastructure in society. And so we'll see when we see these to what extent some of this stuff would make sense in sub-Saharan Africa, and to some extent some of it might not. So definitely my personal focus is more on stuff happening in the US. But I have done a survey in Rwanda, and that was exactly a first era survey. We did area probability sampling. We had enumerators go and visit each area, interview the people face to face. It was very expensive, but very high quality. So if you can do that, then I think, let me also just say one thing. Usually like the era, you think like it's improvement, like a new sports car is better than an old sports car. I don't think that's really the case with surveys. Like, if you can do area probability sampling with face-to-face interviews, that's good. You should do that. But it's usually just so expensive that you can't do it. So don't necessarily think of these as improvements. Think of them as, like, different ways that you can do stuff now, given the way society has changed. Imagine in the U.S., like, showing up at lots of people's houses saying, like, I'd like to come in and talk to you for an hour. It's just, like, really hard to make that happen in a practical way.